Hi, my name is Clive Young, and I'm the editor-in-chief of ProSound News. And it's my pleasure to kick off the pro audio side of today's summit with our podcasting panel. For the next half hour, we'll be talking about podcast production, different approaches and processes, the technologies that are brought to bear on that, how the pandemic affected production, and lots more. Joining us today are Chris Crump, Senior Director of Sales and Marketing at Comrex Corporation, Fela Davis, co-owner of One of One Productions, Dallas Taylor, the owner and host of the popular audio-centric podcast 20,000 Hertz, and Frank Verderosa, senior mixer and sound designer at Digital Arts New York, not to mention a noted podcast engineer. So thank you all for joining us. And to jump right into it, if each of you could tell me a bit about your background and how you're involved in the podcast production world.
Hi, I'm Fela. I'm at my One of One Productions podcast studio in Fort Lee, New Jersey. We have exclusive podcasts like Holding Court with Ebony K. Williams, who's also a cast member of the New York City Housewives on Bravo. We also retail audio kits, so clients that can't make it to the studio. You can purchase audio kits from us, and then we'll mix and master your podcast for you. So yeah, that's me. One of One Productions, Fela.
I got into broadcast actually when I was just in junior high school. I did the church broadcast from our church on WPON in Pontiac, Michigan. But I got into radio broadcast. My first professional job was at WHYT in Detroit, an ABC Cap City station. I went to work for a radio station, some radio stations down in Orlando, Florida, and then a syndicated morning show down there. And I got into the manufacturing side, working for a company called Spectral, making digital audio workstations, and then went to work for Euphonics, Klotz Digital, and I've been at Comrex for the past 17 years. So I've been involved in professional studio applications and in broadcast for, I don't even want to count the years. It's been a while.
So I'm a sound designer, and I lead a sound design company called De Facto Sound and host a show called 20,000 Hertz, which is all about the world's most recognizable and interesting sounds, hopefully just to get normal people into sound.
And Frank.
You know, it's funny because the kind of thing your podcast is about is exactly what got me into this. I remember being a kid and watching like some making of Star Wars special and being fascinated by the sound design. So that led me on a trajectory toward making records, which is where I started. But I kind of burned out on hip hop and the rest of it. Long story short, got into post-production. And mostly because I fell in love with all the digital tools. At the time, Solid State Logic Screen Sound was king. And now, 30 years later, I'm a sound designer, mixer, occasional composer at Digital Arts in New York. And I also produce and record podcast work, among other things, on the side.
Very cool. All right, so you all come to podcasting from different, really very, very diverse corners of the pro audio world. What drew you to the podcast format? I mean, did the fact that you came from these other areas, did that give you insight as to how you wanted to approach it, or perhaps how you develop best practices, that kind of thing?
I know for me, falling into podcasting was almost an accident. I always enjoyed podcasts when they sort of were a new thing, but the quality on them was often terrible, right? It would really bother me. Kids in dorm rooms making shows, but sometimes the content was so engaging that you'd forgive the quality. And for me, Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal Podcast was one of those. I love the show, hated the sound. I'd worked with Gilbert on cartoons and other stuff at the studio. So by a chance connection, I ended up becoming their engineer and then eventual audio producer for the whole show, and took them from a Blue Yeti on a kitchen table at Gilbert's place with people calling in on a speakerphone to everybody on 416s in a soundproof booth, doing it properly, because I really believe sound matters. Quality matters. So that was sort of my, and at Nutmeg at the time, we'd done a number of corporate podcast jobs for clients that needed it, but it was never like a trajectory for me. But Gilbert's thing put me in that arena in a much bigger way.
And for me, I I'm a live sound audio engineer. I come from that world. I forgot to mention. So I was in that world for about 20 years. And the way that I got into the touring with like Christian McBride was through posting on on places like LinkedIn. He found me. And so I knew the importance of stuff being online. And then once I got into the Adam Carolla show was my podcast show, that I was like, oh, this is really cool. You can do a long form talk, and it was comedy, and he had great interviews, and I was like, oh, I would love to do that too. And he mentioned that. He was like, if you're into something, you should do your own podcast. And that was like 5-6 years ago. And 3 years ago, I started the Art of Music Tech podcast, where we interview musicians that I work with here in the city, and just growing it from there. And it kind of took off, and then other people were asking, well, how do you do that? But I mean, because being an audio engineer, we already had the gear and stuff like that. So we started doing it for other people, and then it was like, okay, we need our own space instead of doing it in we space. I don't know, what is it? WeWorks and stuff like that. Exactly. So we did that for about a year, and then 2 years ago we found this space, and we've been going ever since. So it was kind of like, oh, this is a way to sell yourself. I saw that early, and the fact that you could go long form and not be rushed. It was a real turn on, and the fact that nobody was a gatekeeper on it yet. There was no guy that had been doing it for 30 years. So I knew it was going to be a little bit easier to get into the game with this. So, so I took my swing at it and been swinging ever since.
So I spent a lot of time in the sound design world prior to starting the podcast, about 15 years. And in that time, in advertising and trailers and promos, I noticed that like even that industry with only two things, like two senses, like human senses to tell stories with, even in that world, it was like very just like picture focused. And then that sound felt a little bit more like an afterthought, like it was just this finishing job. And so over time, you just knowing all these stories within sound design studios and stuff, I just wanted to start getting those stories out to the general public, because I think we have a cultural problem with sound itself. We very much kind of curate 4 of our senses very actively as humans, but with sound we kind of go. We kind of go like music and done. That's the sound side. But the vast majority of the world, of the sonic world, is not music. And so I wanted to do something about it, and I didn't know if it'd be a YouTube show or a podcast. But over time, I really felt like taking away the picture would be the way to tell those stories. And so came into it through sound design, still do that, and still own a company that does that. But really just wanted to get these stories out there as kind of my own mission in life, to hopefully in my little small way start to bring people into this world and find out how cool it is, like we all know.
Indeed. So Chris, I mean, I know that people certainly typically associate the equipment of Comrex with Comrex making equipment for the radio and TV broadcast world. But I know that some of those tools are also appropriate for high-end podcast production. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that.
Well, we do come from the broadcast side. And if you think about it, there's like 250,000 podcasts that are out there, and there's probably only a couple of hundred that are really popular and people download and listen to. I don't do a podcast. I don't have a lot of interest to do it because I don't really think I'd have anything that interesting for people to listen to other than talking about Comrex stuff, because that's my life. But one of the things that you know is that broadcasters, radio broadcasters, look at WNYC, NPR, KCRW, are producing podcasts on a regular basis. So they have broadcast facilities and they have high quality microphones. One of the things that's always been a challenge for broadcasters is dealing with remote content, whether it's a remote guest calling in on a cell phone or a bad cell phone. Is kind of like nails on a chalkboard a lot of times, because you really can't hear them well. It takes a lot of the audio quality out of the equation. So we have tools that will allow podcasters to bring in high quality content, guests from anywhere on the planet, just by sending a simple link and a click, and using high quality algorithms, very low latency and reliable transmission of content from the remote side to the podcast side.
Very cool. All right. Well, since to take it back to everybody, since we're talking about tools and audio solutions pre-pandemic, what were your various production processes like? I mean, what were some of the tools you were using, the services? How were you interacting with other folks to make your shows?
I know in the case of Gilbert's show, when I was still involved with that, it was largely in-person interviews, but a lot of the guests ended up being in California, with Gilbert and his co-host being in New York. So we had to start implementing Skype. Initially, they did a lot of phone calls. I kind of upgraded them from phone calls to Skype. And then when we shifted over to Earwolf, they had a much better infrastructure where we were sync recording. So if our guest was there and on Skype, they recorded on their end, I married it together on our end, and then kind of post-mixed it. So those were the tools, and obviously that's all changed now. And I've since learned about other tools that would have made that process even better, I think, back then, but that was sort of our thing.
StreamYard, actually what the platform that we're on now, is what I found during COVID. Like that was the first tool that was new for us at the time. We were having a little trouble with Zoom sometimes, and I wanted to get the logo off. And so once I found StreamYard, that was really good for a lot of our other guests who were coming on. I mean, and now we're starting to dip in with other things like Zencastr and things like that. So yeah, so those two are the two main tools that kind of like changed the game since the pandemic for us. And before that, yeah, it was a lot. We didn't even use Zoom before too much, actually at all. It was like a lot of in-person interviews coming into the studio. So that was definitely an add-on, bringing in something like StreamYard. So
on our side, we've probably done probably 300 or 400 interviews by now. We've never done them in person. I think I've done it like one time at a podcast convention. But prior to COVID, we would always send our guests into the nearest studio that we could find, or send a tape sync recordist directly to the guest while we talk over the phone. That was ideal, just because we knew that we would get something great. Because we're a show about sound, we feel like we have to set a bar for all podcasting, I guess. Maybe that's a self-imposed thing, but that's what we did prior to COVID. As soon as COVID hit, now we do a lot of sending people microphones and getting a lot of tests ahead of time, because we still don't want to sacrifice any of that quality. The only times we have to make an exception is when it's a guest that we just cannot get any other way after we've exhausted all options. So we usually will use something called what is that thing called? It's where you can use your phone to TalkSync to record directly with your phone's microphone, which isn't so bad when you get that clean. Some people do it with the Audio Notes app that you can change to high quality. And if you hold it straight up to your face, it can sound pretty decent while we're talking to them on another phone with an earbud in. So that's the biggest exception that we'll make. But we still like to send microphones to everyone and just leave it to them, leave it for them as a gift. But I really hope that as soon as we can put people right back into a studio or with a tape syncer, we'll do it in a heartbeat, just because it's so much cleaner. It takes a lot of pressure off. But yeah, currently we also we connect with this thing called Clean Feed, which is just audio only. And the reason we love it is because there is no gotcha of if they drop the call that we lose all the audio. And that's a big thing for me, is just having the confidence to be able to wrap something up and they don't just like immediately lose all their audio. So yeah, that's how we do it.
Okay. It's certainly, it's a lot. The pandemic has created a lot of different ways and a lot of different ways that we've had to react to how things get produced at this point. Are there any methodologies or best practices that you had developed beforehand that you had to change because of this, or perhaps there's some methodologies that you've come up with in the time since then? I know you mentioned finding tools, for instance, but are there any approaches that you've said, there's a different way to do this now?
I know for me, very early in lockdown, I started hosting a lot of webinars particularly for voice actors to get up to speed working at home, and to kind of educate them on the tools of my day-to-day trade, which is post-production. So it's a Source Connect world for that. And for those that don't have Source Connect now is like the free version, but it's just another Chrome variant. It's the same as Clean Feed, Bidalgo Call, all those other things that are out there. Clean Feed's super cool because it's so easy. So I'm kind of been migrating people over to that for certain purposes. There's a podcast I produced last season, their previous season where they were using just audio on Zoom, and the host was recording at home. It's a call-in style show. It's on video games, so they had a lot of, gaming personalities on. It's great. Their first season was entirely on Zoom, and it didn't sound very good. We kicked it up a notch when I got involved, got her recording on a good mic, guests on Zoom. But now for this next coming season, I'm going to shift them over to Clean Feed because it's just so much better.
One of the reasons we created this product is called Opal. Right. And you've mentioned Clean Feed, you've talked about Source Connect. This has really got a professional broadcast interface on it for professional audio connectors. And it's got a web interface with a connect button that you just send to the guest. They hit connect, and they are basically doing 20 hertz to 22 kilohertz audio through a web browser, similar to some of the things you were talking about, but without having to go through a server. Basically, this is the server. And it's one of the things that NFL has depended upon for a lot of their podcasts. Learfield IMG College produces a lot of college broadcast team shows for like a college podcast. So they're using this technology in a way that makes it easy for coaches that are non-technical, but still maintains really high audio quality and really low delay. So I think it's definitely something to consider beyond just some of the free softwares that are out there.
Yeah, I'll be looking that up as soon as we end this call.
Definitely. Oh yeah, I did some research on Opal. Yeah, that's a really dope device. Yeah, definitely something I'm thinking about for here.
And I know I'm the odd one out here being the broadcaster, but a lot of we have a lot of folks that are using our Bricklink codec, which kind of avoids having to do the tape sync because you're doing two-way audio using algorithms like, it could be linear, it could be AAC, it could be high efficiency AAC, and a whole family of really high quality algorithms to produce really low latency audio. And as long as you're feeding a mix minus back to the guest, they're not going to hear themselves back, and you can record the whole thing. And there's a reliability layer that's built in there that you don't have on some of these internet-based programs.
What's amazing to me, because this is news to me, because I've been in my own little production bubble here for 12 months, but I've grown and learned as much during the pandemic as I have in the decade before it. The things I took for granted, like just plug in Source Connect to the studio and connect to a studio, and I never thought much about what's under the hood. But now I have to teach it to actors constantly. So I just love that. I love that about our business on the whole. It never stops changing and growing. So that box sounds super cool.
Yeah.
Well, the pandemic has taught us a lot about everything. We actually had to create studios for people that were used to going into a studio every day, and engineers had to hand them a box that they could go home and connect to from home. And now everyone's broadcasting from home, podcasting from home, and doing everything from home. So it's been a huge learning curve for all of us, I think.
I love it. You know, and as simple as it sounds to us, I no longer take for granted what I know as an engineer. The simplest things like opening up Source Connect standard and choosing inputs and outputs. A large number of people I have to connect with don't realize that that's something they have to do all the time. And you start every job having to kind of figure that out with them or consult with them ahead of time. So I get it. I mean, you know, I'm not an actor. They're not audio engineers. You know, we're all trying to meet in the middle, but the way we've all come together and found a way forward to keep making commercials, TV shows, films, I'm just floored by it. I love it. I'm nerding out, and I never have to leave my basement. It's pretty great.
Yes, agreed.
So as the pandemic subsides, rather, and with more folks getting vaccinated and such, I mean, there's a lot of aspects where we want things to go back to the way they were. Are we going to see podcasting processes and these different things go back a bit to the way they were, or is all this just permanently changed and we only move onward into the future?
I feel like it's personally changed it. It's just more options in what we do now, whether it's to stay home or come to a studio like mine. And now we can adjust to it as well and still be able to give great, you know, edits and mixing and doing all the stuff that, you know, gives it that broadcast sound and feel. So I think we just expanded it. You know, I don't think it'll ever go back to what it was.
Well,
Yeah, I agree.
you said, I mean, we made it really easy for people not to have to go into a studio. So why would they if they could do it from home? So yes, I think things have permanently changed.
I said early on in the pandemic, you know, it really is a watershed moment, the analogy I always gave is that earthquake in Japan years ago that kind of put an end to videotape when those facilities were, you know, quickly put an end to. So we shifted to an all digital workflow that was already trending that way. And I think the same goes for us. I think, though, really depending on what you're doing, you may or may not go back to the way things were. You know, I have a neighbor who produces some incredibly successful podcasts with a company called Gen Z Media. And his workflows, he'll send me screen grabs of his Pro Tools with like Source Connect Pro with multiple instances, Source Connect Standard, Nexus bringing people in over Source Connect Now, or Clean Feed, recording 5-6 actors at a time in his Pro Tools rig with music cues and the rest. Can't even get my brain around some of what he's pulled off. But so we know now that we can do this remotely. We can make concessions for people that aren't comfortable coming back in. But there are some clients, at least in the post world, and I'm assuming in the podcast, where they'd rather be at a studio. They don't want to deal with the tech. And quite frankly, we know it'll sound better. So I think it's going to be a mixture. It's going to take time. Comfort levels are going to take time to get back. I
agree. COVID has sucked, but in a lot of ways we've just zoomed like 20 years into the future with it, tech-wise. So in the podcasting specific space, there's a lot more people who are audio literate based off of that. There are going to be certain types of stories that I want to be physically present, that it does feel like I'm being held back a little bit by not being present. I think that I do yearn a lot for the eye contact and that lack of latency. So I do see myself wanting to just have the experience of being with somebody occasionally, but I still think that like it's just going to be few and far in between. It's just I think we're not going to have to waste so much time like we used to. Prior, there would be meetings that I would take prior to COVID that I would literally have to fly across the country to get someone's attention to actually pay attention to me. So I think that in that case, now being able to just hop on something in 15 minutes and not spend 3 days traveling is great. But I do think that there are times that I really, really want to be present with someone, especially when you're trying to get something really special and deep. So I think it's going to be mixed, but I think it'll definitely be air heavily on the side of we are probably changed forever.
Fair enough. All right, so it's about time to wrap up, but one last question. How can people who are watching this find you all on the web to ask you more questions or check out your products in Chris's case or in Fela's case for that matter, and check out your work?
Well, you can catch me at is spelled out ONE, One of One Productions with an S at the end.com. And my email is Fela at oneofoneproductions.com if you want to get in touch with me. So
Chris?
Mine's real easy. Comrex.com. You can find all of our products online there. We have videos, all kinds of information. And then you can also email me at Chris, CHRIS, at Comrex.com.
So with mine, you can reach me through my website, DallasTaylor.com. But you can subscribe to the podcast 20,000 Hertz, which is all spelled out, TWE, etc., in all of the podcast players. And then over on the De Facto Sound side, defactosound.com, and the most interesting social media for that company is on Instagram. So following De Facto Sound on Instagram, we sometimes post really silly sound design videos, and then a lot of times some really epic sound design stuff mixed in with a few little podcast tidbits.
You can find me at frankverderosa.com, and there's actually a chat tab right there, which is effectively a text to me. You can reach out to me there. You can check out kind of what I've been up to. And then also digitalartsnewyork.com is the studio in Manhattan where all the big work gets done. And find me anywhere fine social media is served. I'm on Clubhouse all the time. If you're on there, you can find me.
Great. Well, thank you all for appearing on the panel. And for those of you watching, stay tuned for Craig Anderton's Pro Audio keynote. What's next? New tech for audio creation, collaboration, and distribution.